Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Sheriff of Kings County and the co-chair of the committee today. And I think what I'd like to do is, obviously, we'll kick the meeting off. It's 10:07. I forgot I was supposed to announce the time. And so we'll call the meeting to order, and then we do have some introductions, and I'll turn to Nancy. Would you like all of us to introduce ourselves, or would you like to go through the introductions and get that started?
I would like to introduce the new DOJ team members along with CJIS, but I think it'd be great, for returning and new board members to get to know each other. So if individual introductions.
Why don't we do that, and we'll start on the right over there, and if you're new, silence, and then if you're old,
You know what, never mind, just let it
roll.
Let it roll.
Let it roll, everybody. We'll start on the right and
Perfect.
work our way through. Okay,
Yes.
we'll just start on the right if you'll just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name is Trent Simmons. I'm a research assistant over at the Department of Justice, and I recently graduated from UC Davis with my PhD in biological psychology.
Thank you.
My name is Kevin Walker. I'm a research associate at Research Justice. Sorry, my mic went out there for a second. And yeah, I've been working on this project since 2017-ish. Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Audra Opdyke. I'm an assistant director at the Department of Justice.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Choi. I'm a program manager at DOJ over what's called our Client Services Program, and one of the systems that we support is the Stop Data Collection System.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Israel. I'm an attorney with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section in the Department of Justice.
Good morning. My name is Oscar Barbaro. I'm president of the California Public Defenders Association. I'm also a deputy public defender in Solano County, Northern California, and I've been a member of the board since its inception.
Warren Stanley, Commissioner of the California Highway Patrol, been a member of the board since 2017.
Good morning. I'm Douglas Oden. I'm a partner in the law firm of Oden, law firm of Oden and Green in San Diego, California. So welcome to all you folks who may be out of town. I've been a board member since the inception of this board.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sahar Durali. I'm an associate director of litigation and policy at Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles, which is the legal aid in LA that covers the northern half of the county. I've been on the board since its inception. Trying to talk this morning. And when I started, I was working in legal aid in the Central Valley. I'm really excited to see everyone here today, and I'll hand it over to Sheriff Rob.
Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Andrea Guerrero. I'm the executive director at Alliance San Diego. Welcome to San Diego. And I'm the co-chair of the board, at least today. And I have been with the board since its inception.
Hello, I'm Damon Kurtz. I'm the current vice president of Peace Officers Research Association of California, otherwise known as PORAC. I'm a current Fresno police officer, and I've been an officer about 25 years. So, thank you, and I'm a new board member.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Steve Raphael. I'm a professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy, and I'm a brand new board member, my first meeting, and I do empirical research on the criminal justice system.
And good morning, I'm David Swing. I'm the police chief in the city of Morgan Hill, and I'm also representing the California Police Chiefs Association.
Good morning, all. I'm J. Edgar Board, Senior Minister of First AME Church in Los Angeles, and a board member since its inception.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Sun. I'm a special assistant to the Attorney General working on civil rights, public safety, and criminal justice reform.
Hi, I'm Nancy Beninati. I'm the Supervising Deputy Attorney General of the Civil Rights Enforcement Section, and I've been with this project before its inception.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Elgard. I'm a Deputy Attorney General with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section of the Attorney General's Office.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Aisha Martin Walton. I am a retired annuitant. I've had 35 years of public service, and in 30 in the Department of Justice, many positions, but I'm most proud of the work that I've done with community and law enforcement. So thank you very much, and it's good to be here.
Nancy, did you have any others in the audience that you needed to introduce?
We have Dominique Alcaraz, who is one of our also Department of Justice attorneys that is working on this project. I can do the introductions and explain who everybody is during the DOJ update if you like, or I can do it now.
No, that'd be wonderful. Go right ahead.
Okay, so as you all heard, we have a new special assistant, Christine Sun. She is filling the vacancy that was left by Kelly Evans. So we expect to see Christine at the board meetings and in an active role. She came to us first from the Southern Poverty Law Center and then the ACLU of Northern California. And so we're really excited to have her on the team. She's already, in her first week, dove right into this report. And so, this is a really important project for our office and the state. And we're really excited to have Christine on board with us. And I believe you've met Allison at one of our last meetings. And as you know, Kelsey Geiser has headed off to law school. Allison is an attorney. She's going to be working on the report. And I know that you've all gotten to know her a little bit. She came to us working from Equal Justice Society with Eva Patterson, and she's taught racial bias or
Strategic litigation for racial justice.
strategic litigation, racial justice at Stanford. So we're really excited to have Allison as well. And Aisha is coming to us to help us with to really help manage the board and be the base of the board and be your contact in getting the board meetings organized and the subcommittee meetings organized. So Aisha will become your point of contact for scheduling and things of that nature. So if you have any questions about any of that, you can ask any of us, and we'd be happy, to direct you to whomever. I don't know, Audra, would you like to introduce Trent or?
So Trent is with the Research Center. I'm not over the Research Center. However, Trent, you've been with the department for how long?
About 2 months.
About 2 months. And I believe he's assisted with the development of the Research Center's portion of the report.
Great, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. And just a couple little housekeeping notes. Obviously, we're trying to live stream today, so if you can use the microphones and speak into the microphones or talk a little bit louder so it picks it up from a little bit of a distance. And also for the public, at some point you'll have an opportunity to come up and provide public comment. I would just ask that you do the same. Please speak into the microphone so the audio for those that couldn't actually travel can pick it up from wherever they're at. Department of Justice has asked a couple of housekeeping measures today for motions. If you'll state your name when you make the motion, and if you second the motion, state your name as well, so that way the audio can pick up who made the motion and who seconded the motion on the board. And I think that covers the housekeeping tips that you needed. So, well, thank you. Welcome again, everyone. And so we'll just roll through the agenda item as presented today. So we've obviously called to order number 1, welcome and introduction number 2, and so item number 3 is approval of the April 8th, 2019 meeting minutes. If anyone has had an opportunity to review those and would like to make a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Okay. Thank you, Sahar. Motion by Sahar. Second by Swing. Okay, we'll call for the vote on that motion in second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions?
Damon Kurtz will abstain. I was not abstaining.
Very good. Okay, thank you. And then item number 4 is an update from the Department of Justice.
So I've given our update about staffing already, and then I'll turn it over to Allison to give a brief update on upcoming subcommittee meetings and the report itself.
Good morning, everyone. So as you see, and there are copies over there for the members of the public who come in too, we have a first draft of the report that we will be discussing today. And so this draft is the hard work, result of the hard work of all the subcommittees and board members and the Research Center and the Department of Justice. So we really look forward to discussing all of the contents and the analyses that are in the report and hearing everyone's feedback from the board and from members of the public as well. And we do have upcoming subcommittee meetings coming up in October, and those will be noticed 10 days before the meetings, but we have a few scheduled already. The civilian complaints meeting will be Friday, October 18th. The state and local racial and identity profiling policies and accountability meeting will be October 23rd. The calls for service meeting will be October 25th, and the stop data analysis meeting will be October 10th. And so we will notice all of those meetings 10 days ahead of time, and those meetings will also be open to all members of the public, and we will have locations for those meetings around California. And so we would also welcome everyone to attend those meetings and give their feedback on the different sections of the report that are going to be discussed, because those meetings are also where you'll see and get to discuss a lot of what the substance of the report is.
Yes, so we have already noticed the November 20th meeting in Oakland. Our plan is to have the discussions today with the board about some of the feedback of the draft report. And then you've probably already seen that there are placeholders where there's content that is still in development. We're hoping to, we'll be getting that completed. So the next full draft that the board itself will see will be at the November 20th meeting. And so the hope is that that draft will be very complete and almost final. And however, if it is not, we will have another board meeting by teleconference, as we have in the past. I think it's December 9th. And so we're probably going to go ahead and we'll notice those meetings, but if at the November meeting there are just some cleanup items or things like that, we can always take that meeting off calendar. So it's dependent upon on sort of the status of the report and how comfortable the board feels with it. And as Allison mentioned, a lot of the work from between now and the November meeting will be done within the subcommittee itself. And so we're hoping that by the subcommittee meetings, we have a lot of the content that was not already provided to you to give to the subcommittees themselves so that they can address and review those materials. So I think in terms of the report, that's where we are. I think we're in really good shape because at this time last year, we did not have any kind of a big comprehensive draft. And so I think lessons learned. We did a lessons learned yesterday with law enforcement, lessons learned for us. I think that having this draft much earlier is going to make the report even that much better than it was last year. So I'm really proud of the DOJ team and the board and getting this all done on a little bit more of an expedited timeline. But it does give a lot more time to really refine the report and make it what the board wants it to be, especially since this is the first year that we're going to be analyzing the data. I think CJIS does have an update as well.
Yes, good morning. I just have a brief update to share with you all, but thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. So one of the things we wanted to keep you abreast of is what's been going on with the stop data collection system. So we have a PowerPoint handout that you could follow along with, but hopefully this will be more conversational. So at a high level, I wanted to just be able to provide a brief update about the status of the data submissions for 2019. We're 3/4 of the way through this new reporting year. Then we have some updates on additional work in progress that the department has been working on, and then, of course, be available for any questions that you may have. So just as a reminder, we had 7 additional agencies come online with collecting this new data set for STOP data as of January 1st of 2019. So we now have 15 of the largest agencies in the state that are collecting the data. I'll not read them all off, but it's there in your screen and also handouts. And then I also just have a kind of graphical representation of that to just identify the parts of the state that are currently collecting the data. And as of this week, we've received just over 650,000 STOP data records submitted into the statewide repository so far for 2019. So it's up to each individual agency, the frequency that they want to start submitting the records into DOJ's system. They're not actually due for 2019 until April 1st of 2020. So some agencies have elected to start sending those into the state repository early. So we have those identified for you there in the handouts. We've got 7 that are already reporting for 2019. And then just to kind of update you on some of the work in progress that we have going on. As Nancy mentioned, we had a lessons learned session yesterday, and we're going to be hosting another one in October. Actually, CHP is made their facility available in Sacramento. So at yesterday's session, we had approximately 30 representatives of law enforcement gather with us, and we invited agencies that started collecting the data as of July 1st of last year, those that came online January 1st of this year, and then also what we call the Wave 3 agencies, the next group that is just in the preparation stage, and they'll start collecting the data as of January 1st of 2021. So it was a time for them to give feedback to us if there's anything that we can do to help with the onboarding and reporting process. There's a lot of great comments. It was just yesterday, so we'll be kind of compiling some formal notes on that, but just wanted to let you know that we are still heavily involved in trying to work closely with the reporting agencies. Something that we've also been in the process of developing is a post-certified class, and the purpose of the class will be to provide like an introduction to AB 953 and the reporting requirements. It's a joint project that we'll be working with the Civil Rights Enforcement section, my area of DOJ that works with the kind of technical implementation, and then the Research Center as well. So we had an initial meeting following up on a subcommittee on this topic from this summer. We've had an initial meeting with Post, and we're going to be doing some follow-up on that. So we'll just keep the board apprised that by mid-2020, we're hoping to have a Post-certified class. Because as we move forward, there's going to be, at some point, over 400 agencies collecting this data set. So we're just trying to develop a number of different tools of getting agencies prepared and ready to do this work. So we'll continue to keep you informed about that. And then last but not least, we are working with other agencies that are going to be coming online. We'll know in January of 2020 exactly who's in the next reporting group, but at this point in time, it looks like there's going to be 10 to 11 agencies that will start collecting the data January 1st of 2021. Or no later than that. And we actually have 2 agencies that have elected to start collecting the data set early. That's also an option to them. So just to let you know, both Bakersfield PD and Los Angeles School District PD have elected to start collecting the data set early. They'll start collecting as of January 1st of 2020. So we have been working closely with their teams to get them ready, do testing. For Bakersfield PD, they're going to be using the DOJ-hosted web application. So in November, we'll be spending some time on site with them and doing trainer sessions of how to use our system. And then Los Angeles School District PD is developing their own local application, and we've been doing some testing to make sure that when they push records to the DOJ system, it works seamlessly. So that's kind of a brief update of some of the activities that CJIS has been working on. If you have any questions, happy to answer them now or later as well.
Board members have any questions of Department of Justice? Thank you, Aaron. Very good. Yes, sir.
Douglas Oden, I wanted to know, when you had the hosting of the lessons learned, what were the lessons learned?
We're going to take some time to digest. It was a 3-hour-long meeting, but some of the topics that we discussed with them was about training. All these agencies have implemented the system, and now, there's literally thousands of officers collecting this data, so feedback that they have for us on that. Some of it was to make sure that we have different styles of training available, not only in person, which can be helpful, but then online tools as well. And keeping them short, something that can be utilized with agencies possibly in like their roll calls where they could, have a audience and get information out quickly. So we'll continue to develop those. One of the comments I know I heard yesterday was encouraging agencies to submit their records early. There's a deadline of April 1st, but there's some advantages of getting it into our system early just in case there are errors. So that was positive. And then I think one of the requests also from agencies is if we could, in the trainings or future materials that we develop, address different scenarios. There are scenarios contained in the regulations to advise them, but that was some of the feedback that they gave us is that when they're trying to implement, they get some recurring questions about different scenarios that the officers are encountering. So that was some of my takeaways. I don't know if you have anything else.
I think a couple of the comments that we received from the agencies were that the staffing and the resources and the time that it's taking to review the narrative fields and the submissions before they're submitted to Department of Justice was a little bit more than they anticipated. So I think there were some comments regarding the narrative fields. In addition to that, I think the other one was from a technology standpoint for the Department of Justice to allow adequate time for them to make any adjustments or changes to their system whenever we have a change. But as Aaron stated, we will be compiling official notes, and those will be available.
Very good, thank you. Any additional questions from board members?
Were there requests for additional funding from the agencies in order to accomplish the reporting?
Yeah. Not from us.
It's my understanding, and San Diego can speak for themselves because they're here, but there was a submission on the board to the mandates, and that is where the submissions have to go, and those, I guess, are reviewed by the Department of Finance. And I don't have the specifics, but it seems like it may be a challenge to get some funding.
Yeah, and I'll make a comment on that. I reviewed the request by San Diego Police Department to the Office of State Mandates on the challenges that they're already seeing with compiling the data, the staff time it takes, and working with it. And it was several $1 million that they have requested through the Office of State Mandates to fund the resources that they need to implement AB 953. And so, we'll see how that works through the process with the Office of State Mandates. I imagine that there'll be other agencies that also do the same thing as we move forward. One of the challenges this board has discussed with the agencies implementing, and as we get into even some of the smaller agencies, is the funding that this board has made very clear to advise the legislatures that, hey, you have to fund this. This is very important, but we can't expect agencies just to take on this responsibility without giving some funding to it. And so, personally, I'm hopeful that the Office of State Mandates recognizes that and reports back to the legislature that this should absolutely be funded.
And I did let the members know that the board strongly supports that these initiatives be funded.
Thank you. Very good. Any other additional comments or questions from board members at this point on what we've heard so far? Okay, very good. Moving into item number 5, we're going to go into the subcommittee reports, and I believe everybody knows who's going to be giving the report from their specific subcommittee. And so the first subcommittee report is 5A, which is the Civilian Complaints Subcommittee. And so if whoever knows they're giving that report will Very good. Sahar, thank you.
Hi. So the last subcommittee that we had, the Civilian Complaints Subcommittee, discussed whether or not the committee should create a model form or create items that should be included by every agency in a model form. Where we landed was that a model form should be created by this board or the Department of Justice so that it's easy for law enforcement agencies around the state to adopt it for their own purposes. There were also recommendations that translations be made at least into the 12 threshold languages that are used in California of these forms so that agencies can pull those forms directly from a website from the Department of Justice and implement them internally. The other issue, though, that we came across that we keep coming to is the Penal Code 148.6 language that's required to be included in the forms, which for the members of the public's sake, I'll read what this section says. That it says that you have the right to make a complaint against a police officer for any improper police conduct. California law requires this agency to have a procedure to investigate citizens' complaints. You have a right to a written description of this procedure. This agency might find after investigation that there's not enough evidence to warrant an action on your complaint. Even if that is the case, you have the right to make the complaint and have it investigated if you believe an officer behaved improperly. Citizen complaints and any reports or findings related to complaints must be retained by the agency for at least 5 years. It is against the law to make a complaint that you know to be false. If you make a complaint against an officer knowing that it is false, you can be prosecuted on a misdemeanor charge. I've read and understood the above complaint, and it requires a signature by a complainant. The Ninth Circuit ruled that this language was unconstitutional, so we have a conflict between state law and federal law. So in order to recommend a model complaint form, there is some reticence on behalf of the committee members to recommend that a model form be created that does or doesn't include this language, because on the one hand, there's the California Penal Code section, on the other hand, there's the Ninth Circuit that says that language is unconstitutional. What Member Szilard had recommended was that the DOJ do some additional research, I think, into legislative changes that the board could recommend. I know that's been on our agenda for a while now, so I guess my question is what perhaps the DOJ is thinking with respect to that language and what the appetite is on the board for recommending clarifying that language, because it is a conflict. I know, for instance, Los Angeles, I believe it's the sheriff and not the city, does not include that language because they don't want to be at risk for lawsuits because of the Ninth Circuit finding that language unconstitutional. So I think I wanted to turn it over to the DOJ because I do think it would be really important for us to create a model form rather than just model language to be included in a form so it can easily be pulled and implemented by law enforcement agencies. So is there any?
I'll just chime in and ask DOJ, would you prefer we go through the subcommittee reports? Is that something that will be addressed in the next subcommittee meeting to those subcommittees, or would you like to respond to that at this point?
We can answer the question.
Okay.
I was not aware that that the directive was to ask the DOJ to actually draft proposed statutory language. My understanding was that the board was interested in having a letter drafted urging the legislature to change the statute and to more comply with what the federal court was saying. So that content is in the report right now, saying that the board will be doing the letter.
Oh, okay.
So given that I think the subcommittee at least agreed that there was the conflict, that at this time, that it would not be necessarily something that the board would want to do and go forward with the form itself. But if the legislature ends up changing the language in the statute, then we could look at the issue of the form. So that was the reason that the proposed language for the model language was suggested and going forward in this year's report.
I think there was just, I think there wasn't necessarily a directive to change the statutory language. I think it's more, we wanted to potentially see some solution to this issue, just because, I think what we're seeing with a lot of agencies around the state is a lack of resources, is what we've heard. So I think having a form ready where people can just use it, it's been translated, I think would be really good for people all around California. So I think there was more a desire for movement on the issue because there's an impasse. And I guess it's in the report. I read it. I must have missed that part. Yeah.
Right.
I'm not sure.
And the other thing is, you're correct. There are many, many agencies that are recommending that they do not include that language because there is still the potential to be sued in federal court. And you probably didn't see this, but there's a little footnote to a San Francisco Police Department bulletin that really lays out what the issues are and how they are dealing with the issue of whether or not to prosecute or arrest for that penal code violation. And so I do agree that this is an issue that should be resolved. And so would you like us to go forward and draft a letter for the board to send to the legislature, urging them to take this issue on during the next session?
I'll defer to Sahar on the subcommittee and kind of what came out of the subcommittee recommendation.
Yeah.
So I'll just defer to you to talk more specifically about what that subcommittee was looking for.
Yeah, I think that's what, one thing I have to just say, I, as in my organization, we're not allowed to personally recommend per our funding changes, lobbying of the legislature, so I can't say that, but we can leave. I think there's a desire, though, to deal with the impasse by the committee members so we can create a model form. One thing I had suggested was maybe like an explanatory paragraph about this section in a model form, but then I think what Member Szilard was saying was that including the language plus an explanatory section, it still opens up offices to liability or agencies to liability. So I'll push it back to you all to see what you want to do, and I'd have to abstain on something like that.
Any comments from other board members?
I just had a question. What portion of the statute did the Ninth Circuit find unconstitutional, if you know? Or if you know.
It's complicated, but basically, I think it's subdivision B that has the attestation in there that has to be signed under penalty of perjury. And basically says that the person knows that if they're submitting a false complaint, it's a misdemeanor.
Perhaps there
should come
on. There we go. I'm not on the committee, but perhaps there are other members of the committee who would consider making a motion. I think this is worth a motion for the board to consider in order to move forward on this. We're in a good time of the year to move forward on something like this. If we can ask for a letter and get one in time for our next meeting, that would be well timed for legislative action at the beginning of the year. So perhaps there's somebody else in the committee who could make a motion.
Can we ask for other comments first?
Sure.
Any other comments by board members? I just have a question, a process question on that. Because it's not an agendized as a motion, would it just be advisory at this point to bring it back on the agenda, or can a motion?
You can make a motion at any time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I would make a motion for a legal opinion from the Department of Justice on drafting an appropriate form that's consistent with the Ninth Circuit ruling, so that we could promote or include in our report a form and an encouragement for people to be able to file a form that doesn't run afoul of the Ninth Circuit opinion.
So
This is Doug Oden. I would second that motion.
May I make a statement?
You can.
So what you're actually now making a motion for is a formal Attorney General opinion
Correct.
on an issue, and they take years.
To legislative actions faster?
Yes. So if you want, the board, we looked at this a couple of years ago, and it's my understanding the board can ask for a formal Attorney General opinion. However, it does not go through civil rights. We have an opinions unit. They get the request, and then they decide, they make the decisions, and they do the analysis. And it could take a very long time.
I'll just ask with that, would you like to maybe amend your motion?
No, I think no time like the present. Let's start and see how long it takes.
Okay.
Well, if I could
Go
add,
ahead.
Is there an alternative, or what are our options here? Because could we, for example, send a letter directly to the legislature and ask them to develop a fix?
Yes.
So perhaps.
Well, that'd be my second motion.
Okay. That seems like a faster way forward. Do you want to perhaps restate your motion?
Well, I do think the Attorney General should issue an opinion on the statute if it does run afoul of the Ninth Circuit Court in interpreting that. So I am requesting that. That has been seconded, and I would ask that, or my motion is that the Attorney General seek to have such an opinion first, and then I would address the second motion.
And as the person who seconded that motion, I concur with the recommendation of Oscar, Member Oscar, regarding the official opinion of the Attorney General. So I would second that motion again.
Okay, any additional comments on the motion and the second? Okay, hearing none. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So is the motion to write a complaint form and submit that to the Attorney General for opinion?
No, the motion on the table was to make the request of the Attorney General to give us a legal opinion on the conflict between the two issues, the Ninth Circuit and what the state law says.
Oh, okay.
And is that correct?
Yes.
Any additional comments? I think for ease of tracking, we should probably just do a roll call down the line. Would that be appropriate, Nancy?
Sure.
Okay. So we'll start over here with Oscar.
Yeah, I'm voting yes.
Correct. Okay. Tim? Oh, Tim's not here. I'm sorry. Commissioner?
Aye.
Aye.
Sahar? Sorry.
This is the advisory, the motion for the advisory. Okay, aye.
David Robinson, aye.
Andrea Guerrero, aye.
Damon Kurtz, aye.
Stephen Raphael, aye.
LaWanda Hawkins, aye.
David Swing, aye.
Jed Gabor, aye.
There's no
Okay,
report.
the motion carries. Thank you. I assume we don't have anyone that didn't vote. I didn't want to miss that. Okay. Well, very good. That motion carries. And if you don't mind, before we move into the next item, we had LaWanda sneak in on us, and so I wanted to give her an opportunity to introduce herself, and then we'll move on with the rest of the agenda. Go ahead, LaWanda.
Good morning. My name is LaWanda Hawkins. I'm from Justice for Murdered Children, and we're located in LA. And I'm sorry I had to bring my great niece with me this morning, but I think this is a great experience for her.
Very good. Thank you, LaWanda.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming. Thank you. Okay, back to the floor here.
Sure. So my second motion would be to request that the board recommend to the legislature an amendment to Penal Code Section 148.6 such that it is consistent with the Ninth Circuit opinion, which deals with the threat of perjury as a penalty for filing such a complaint.
This is Douglas Oden. I second that motion.
Okay, any comments from board members? I would just like to make a quick comment on that. one of the challenges that we face are those frivolous complaints, and personally, we saw one just this last week within our own organization. And so I do think there needs to be some clarification in the law. I don't know if this is the appropriate way to go about it, but as an advisory board, I sure would like to see our legislature take a look at it. I don't know that I would go so strong as to say, tell them what they need to do with it, but I definitely think the law should be taken a look at. I would just state that I don't know that we should tell them how they should do it, but they should definitely look at the conflict and resolve the conflict, because it's a challenge for agencies as well to work through and deal with. So those are just my comments. Any additional comments? Chief?
Comment. David Swing. I want to echo Sheriff Robinson's comments. Also bring up to the fact that with the advent of body-worn cameras today, stops are being recorded, obviously, with increasing frequency. We have the ability to see firsthand as administrators reviewing incidences to see what actually occurred. And so I just think that there needs to be something also, I don't know what the answer is to your point, Sheriff. I just want to encourage us to encourage the legislature to find a solution to also eliminate or to reduce frivolous complaints that may be completely unfounded.
Can I just say, there is on the books a penal code section that deals with filing a false police report and making a material misrepresentation in a police report. Both of those things are crimes and already exist. I think the nature of my motion is that we obviously have a conflict in the current statute with an opinion from a court that has jurisdiction over California. And so the motion is to have the legislature address that conflict so that there is a statute that deals with filing a false police report, and I think, in the opinion of the Ninth Circuit, deters people from filing it because of the threat of a penalty. I don't know that you have to have a threat of a penalty in that statute, given that there is independently a way to prosecute somebody that would file a false police report. So I'm still making a motion. I appreciate the comments.
Any additional comments? Go ahead.
And I appreciate that as well, sir. And just to acknowledge that in our view, filing a complaint against an officer doesn't rise to the level of a report. So I haven't seen that section applied, to your point about how a false police report as it relates to a police conduct complaint, just as a point of clarification.
Okay, very good. Any additional comments by board members?
Sheriff, yeah, I think that if we could limit the recommendation to the clean question of asking the legislature to resolve the conflict in a way that's consistent with the Ninth Circuit, I think then we stay clearly within our purview, and this is something that I would hope that the legislature would see fit to resolve straight away, and recognizing that there are potentially other issues around this, but for our purposes, I think a clean ask is the right way to go, and I would support that motion.
Sure, I'd accept that amendment in regard to the motion.
Okay, very good. Oscar, and with accepting that amendment, is DOJ clear on what that request is now? Or should we have?
I was actually going to ask that maybe with both issues, that both motions, if we could have the board's authority to work with the co-chairs to ensure that whatever is sent is what the board would like sent.
Sure.
Is that agreeable?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So we have a motion and a second on the table. Any additional comments before we take the vote? Okay, very good. We'll start on the right again, and if you don't mind, state your name and your vote, either yes, no, or abstain.
Oscar Barbaro, yes.
Just, can we get clarification on what the second motion is going to be?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the second motion is to ask the Department of Justice to draft a letter recommending to the legislature that they address the conflict between state law and Ninth Circuit law and resolve it in a legislative fix.
Yes.
Thanks for the clarification. I abstain.
Douglas Oden, yes.
I abstain.
David Robinson, abstain.
Andrea Guerrero, yes.
Damon Kurtz, I'm going to abstain.
Stephen Raphael, yes.
LaWanda Hawkins, abstain.
David Swing, abstain.
J. Edgar Ward, aye.
Very good. I'll turn to Nancy and let us know the numbers. Hopefully somebody was tallying.
I have five ayes and 5 abstains. So this is new to me. It's not a majority of the board voting. So I will need to check and get back to you on whether the motion carried.
Okay, we can just take that one under advisement.
Yes.
Do you expect a response before the end of this meeting, or will that be something that you advise the board on at the next meeting?
I'll see what I can do during this meeting.
Okay, thank you. I think that's fair enough. Go ahead, Sahar.
Could I just ask what the appetite is for creating a model form that might have that language, but explaining what and leaving it to LEA discretion? Just because I really think that having a form is really important. I think if we have it, more agencies will adopt it. We've seen a lot of agencies around the state don't have those core elements in their forms that we recommended, but I don't know if that's what people think about that, because I worry that the advisory opinion is going to take like 5 years.
Oh, no.
We'll be here. Yeah, I don't know.
Any other comments by board members to that question?
So Sahar, are you suggesting, this is Andrea, are you suggesting that we consider a model form for the report that we're going to be creating?
Yeah, maybe with some explanatory language around that statute and what the current status is, the fact that we're seeking an advisory opinion, and leaving it to agency discretion to see what they do or don't want to do with it, because some agencies have kept it and some haven't. And so is there harm in creating something like that? Because from what I understand from a lot of our subcommittee meetings, there's an issue with resources in terms of developing forms, translating them, and if we can have a form that more agencies adopt that get at these core elements, I think that would just be really good, given what we've seen in terms of the forms that exist right now.
So then is that a model form or is that model language?
Model form, it's a model form. Because the issue is someone taking we talked about this, right? I think just having a form that people can easily adopt, say it's my agencies, will ensure, I think, that more agencies have a form that gets at all of our, gets at the core elements that we think are necessary. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, David Robinson, I agree. I think that as long as the model form is just something that anybody can just grab and use, but we're not necessarily telling them you have to use this because there is that conflict in the law, I don't disagree with that. I think a model form is a good idea, and I don't think you'd have any pushback from anybody really having that. It's just the conflict creates a challenge for us. And so I don't know that anybody on the board have any additional comments to suggesting that as far as this subcommittee goes, that a model form be created with the Department of Justice's help, and that just be included in this subcommittee to push out for the next report.
Yes, this is Doug Oden. Do we need a motion to get that accomplished? Because I would be in support of it.
I'm turning to Nancy to see, or Allison. Would you need a motion on that to try to include a model form in the next report, or is it too much of an ask at this point?
What do you mean by next report?
For the upcoming annual report in 2020, is it too much of an ask to see if there can be a model form developed for this specific issue?
I think that the real issue has been the conflict, and so I don't think that for this year it
Okay.
would be resolved in time.
Okay.
So perhaps we could just table this, but keep it as an item and an item as ongoing discussion to hopefully get those answers. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. And we'll move into, Sahara, I'm assuming that was completed your subcommittee report?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. And so we'll move into the next subcommittee, and that is state and local racial and identity profiling policies and accountability. Okay, Commissioner?
Good morning. Our meeting was on June 10th, a few months ago, and we had a lot of discussion regarding model policy. We had discussion whether or not should we discuss pros and cons of various policies from the Wave 1 agencies, and then that turned into a longer discussion about a model policy. Should we as a subcommittee and maybe also as a board attempt to develop model policies that all agencies in the state could use regarding bias-free policing. A lot of discussion about that, and basically from the members that part of our subcommittee, we came to the conclusion we felt that that would be a good idea to put together some model policy that all agencies could use and integrate into their operations. So I'll open it up to further discussion from some of the other subcommittee members that were there.
Any additional comments on that subcommittee by any other members?
Yes, I think the question of model everything is going to be a theme today because I think it's one of the concrete acts that the board can take. And so, again, for the same reason that in our last discussion we were interested in model policies, here is to facilitate the adoption of best practices by law enforcement agencies that may not have the resources to be developing these, and also to help with the consistency. These would be recommended, not mandated, but that would be the recommendation that we move forward with model policies. Just to add that this past year we've been collecting policies, we've been reviewing policies. In the last report we had some sample language that people could use. This would be the next step. This would be to actually develop the policy itself.
Any additional comments by board members? And so, just to clarify, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chief.
As we worked on policy in other areas over the last couple of years, I recognize that Lexipol does a lot of the policies for law enforcement throughout California, and just ask that we consider to consult with or contact Lexipol for easier adoption into our profession of law enforcement, as they do a lot of policy work, and that might help with the policy drafting to ensure easier adoption by agencies throughout the state.
And that was part of our discussion, Lexipol, and we also discussed IACP also has model policy that we could possibly take a look at to put this together. So those were the two main entities that we also discussed.
And just to clarify from the subcommittee, so this is the recommendations of this subcommittee in moving forward, but not necessarily that they would be ready for the January 1st rollout of the annual report.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Any additional comments? Okay, I don't think we need any kind of motion out of that subcommittee, if I understand correctly. Thank you. And the next subcommittee is post-training and recruitment.
Okay, Damon Kurtz, I was on that committee and been tasked with giving the update. Majority of our conversation had to do with the implementation of AB 953 and how we go forward with post, creating some sort of a training program for organizations. Much of it was covered earlier with the PowerPoint. That was the majority of the conversation. How do we come up with an implementation of training that maybe has a combination of video and also obviously in-person training, and whether or not there's some in the academy, also the officers out there in the street, and how do we come up with something standardized that we can push through post, so all the agencies as they're starting to come online have a mechanism to train in this on the AB 953 requirements. Obviously using the the agencies that have already come online, you know, the road bumps, the road speed bumps, I should say, that they've hit, and what best practices we can put out to make sure that we kind of are all doing the same thing and that it works. So that was the majority of the conversation, and obviously that's still going to be work in progress. So that's it.
Very good, thank you, Dan. Any comments from this subcommittee? I would just like to point out, you know, for the annual budget this year, Post did receive an increase for training, which is very much needed. And I believe that through this advisory board and echoing how important that is over the last few years, as someone who's been on here as an original board member as well, I think it does have a big impact. And so, you know, a personal thanks to these board members to constantly committing to making sure that there's pressure on the state legislator to say we have to, if we're going to put our mouth out there, we've got to put our money out there too. And I think this advisory board has helped that cause with Post this year in making sure that they received additional funding for training like this. So thank you. The next subcommittee is calls for service, and I will actually handle that one. In the calls for service subcommittee, the majority of our discussion focused on biased and bias-based calls. There was a lot of discussion on, you know, the officers on the street. They have no clue who's calling in, what they're calling in about, et cetera. So we're heavily relying on what the caller is stating to the dispatcher. And a lot of the discussion surrounded around trying to work with Post to make sure that on the dispatcher side of the training, that there was training that also talked about bias on those phone calls, where if somebody's calling in and just blanketly stating, you know, a race, a creed, or whatever, that the dispatcher is recognizing those things and trying to make sure that they're putting out accurate information, but also asking follow-up questions, et cetera. And so a lot of our discussion was based on working with Post to make sure that not only were officers receiving training on receiving that information, but that dispatchers were receiving training on receiving that information into those dispatch centers. So that way, hopefully the bias can be taken out of the call and it can just be based on the facts of the situation. And so that was a lot of the discussion that we had in that subcommittee, and looking at that training curriculum and also looking at some best practices. And I know Sandra's not here today, but she was actually going to share, I believe at the next subcommittee, some information that she had on this specific topic. And so I look forward to that. But overall, through this subcommittee, that was the largest part of the discussion surrounded around those best practices and making sure that that training was appropriate through dispatch and through the officers on the street, so everybody was receiving it equally. And that was all the comments I had on that subcommittee. Anybody have any additional comments on that subcommittee, on the calls for service subcommittee? Okay, very good. And the next and final subcommittee report is stop data analysis. Not sure who has that one. Chief, you have that one?
I think I'll take this one. We had a conference call a few weeks ago, and we reviewed the preliminary data from the Wave 1 agencies. I just want to thank the research team for their work on that. And I can see in reading the draft report that some of the questions we had have been integrated into the final draft, or the draft as it is today, so thank you for that. I think it helped with our understanding of the data to understand the benchmarking that exists in the report and how that helps. Also identifying calls for service and correlate or kind of cross-tabbing that, I guess, against self-initiated or traffic stop data. So overall, a very productive call, and I think that the results of that call have been integrated into our report, so thank you very much for that.
Very good. Any additional comments from members on that subcommittee report? Okay, seeing none. At this time, our next agenda item is public comment, and I'll just point out before we go ahead.
I think the Research Center will also give a brief update for that Stop Data Subcommittee and some of the work, since they've been working on a lot of the analyses.
Okay, great, thank you. I didn't see that on my paper.
It's not on the agenda. So
no,
you're
that's
right.
perfect.
But instead of doing the stop data analysis portion during the Department of Justice update, we just thought that it'd fit better in talking about it during the subcommittee.
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Real quick before I start on that, just a note for the civilian complaint subcommittee. you may all notice that this year's civilian complaint section is a little bit longer in the analysis portion. That was in response to a question we got about examining civilian complaints over time. So this year, we took a little bit different of approach and looked at the number of civilian complaints received statewide dating back to 1981 and kind of looked at it over time. So when you all get an opportunity to view that section, I'm not saying we have to discuss it at this one, but maybe at the next civilian complaints subcommittee meeting on, what was it, the 18th, I think? Yeah, the 18th. It would be good to get feedback on how board members feel about that addition in this year's report. We want to continue that moving forward. So now to switch back to the stop data section here. So what I've got here today is kind of a PowerPoint presentation that goes over a lot of the same information that's in this year's, this version of this year's stop data analysis section. A couple caveats there. As Nancy mentioned earlier, at this point in the year, in previous years, we hadn't had actual draft report content. We had like a bulleted outline, and so we don't have all of the analysis completed at this point in the year. We're still working every day on getting more and more done. So what we have right now is mostly analysis that surrounds searches, because we don't require external data to do those analyses, and we've been sourcing some external data to kind of go through and do some of the veil of darkness technique that we've talked about in previous years that we're going to be including in this year's report, and we'll have that information by the time that the full board reconvenes in November. So we'll be able to look at that then. We just actually reached a major milestone in collecting that information over last weekend, so we can begin doing that soon. But this presentation is primarily on the search data. And so another caveat here is that we're talking about stop data from Wave 1 agencies between July 1st of last year and December 31st of last year. And so everyone here knows, but we don't have information across the whole state yet, and so we're only speaking to those agencies and their data. So another thing is that we're going to, in this year's, yes?
Clarifying question on that.
Absolutely.
When you say you don't have data for the whole state, do you have the CHP data?
We do, yes, we have CHP data, yes. So CHP serves the whole state in a way, but we don't have data from every law enforcement agency.
Do we know from the CHP data that, since they do serve the whole state, what, where the stops are made, and has that been mapped out in some fashion?
Trent, I think we did like a chloropleth on that at some point. So we have tried to map it. As you know, the location field information is collected in a text field per the RIPA stop data collection regulations, and so we've attempted to kind of geocode some of that information, but because officers are able to just write in responses, sometimes when we send that information to be geocoded, we don't get valid returns on those locations, and so it's not quite as precise as we would like, but we can look into doing some, providing like a map of where the stops occurred throughout the state.
Yeah, so we have kind of a working proof of concept of the number of people stopped by county, but we haven't broken up by agency yet. And so right now the CHP data is incorporated with all the other agencies, but it would be a good way to move forward and see if we could separate out CHP to see where the bulk of their stops are occurring.
Okay.
Would that suit your need if we broke down the number of stops that occurred
because
within
you
various
have
counties
broken
throughout
down,
the
or at
state?
least I believe it's broken down in a draft report, any information we've got so far, the agencies and where they're collecting, well, not specifically where, but the agencies and the jurisdictions that they're assigned to. But we don't have broken down where the CHP is collecting data from.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely take that under consideration and try and produce some information at the next board report. Or sorry, next board meeting.
Thank you.
Also, I'll note that we take, all the information in here is contained within the board's report, so the figure numbers are the same as in the report, but we don't present them in the same order, so if it seems like we're like jumping around, it's because the presentation's not in the same order as they occur in the report. But, okay, let's see. So what's going to be in this PowerPoint presentation is basically an examination of the racial and ethnic breakdown of the individuals who were stopped during the Wave 1 reporting period of last year. We also break down the reason why individuals were stopped, also by race and ethnicity. Then we look at the rate at which various race and ethnicities were searched. And then we take a look at search hit rates. And search hit rates, in a nutshell, are how often officers discover contraband or evidence when they perform a search of an individual. So we start off here with a breakdown of the stopped individuals in 2018 by Wave 1 agencies by race and ethnicity. I'll point out here that previously we've had questions about officers being able to select multiple races for a single individual and whether or not that would result in double counting individuals here. The third bar from the right in this, my mic here, the third bar from the right in this figure displays a category of individuals classified as multiracial individuals. And so that's where all the people are accounted for where officers selected multiple races for them. So we are not double counting any individuals in here just because they have 2 or more races selected. And what we see here is that around 40% of the stopped individuals during this time period were Hispanic or Latino, 33% white, 15% black, around 4% Middle Eastern or South Asian, 5.5% Asian, 1.2% multiracial, about a half a percentage point of Pacific Islander individuals, and then 0.2% Native American. And another caveat here, people who are familiar with this project, is that all these identity groups are based on officer perception rather than individuals self-identifying how they identify. And so that'll be true throughout this presentation. So looking forward, officers are required to provide the reason why they stopped each individual in the data collection. And so here we kind of take a look at the bases that were provided for making the stops during the data collection period. We see that a majority of the stops during the data collection period were a result of traffic, or were in response to traffic violations. Traffic violations in the data set are either moving violations, equipment violations, or non-moving violations. And we can see that that's consistently the most cited reason for stopping individuals across race or ethnicity. The second most common reason for initiating a stop of individuals was reasonable suspicion that the person was engaged in criminal activity. And that's fairly consistent across the groups. However, we see that that does vary a bit from the left side of the chart here with black individuals down to the, the PowerPoint went off. Okay, it's back. Down to the right side of the chart with Middle Eastern and South Asian individuals. And then the third most common reason for individuals to be stopped was that their stop was started as a consensual encounter, which resulted in a search, and that constituted 2.2% of the encounters that were captured in 2018. All other bases for initiating a stop had less than or equal to 1% of the stopped individuals, and so those other bases are that the person was known to be on supervision, that officers knew this person to have an outstanding warrant, to investigate whether the person was truant. And then for stops of students on K-12 campuses, officers also have the option of selecting that they were investigating whether a student's conduct warranted discipline under the education code, and to determine whether or not the student violated school policy. And so we kind of, for the purpose of this graphic, because each of those reasons for stops were such a small percentage of stopped individuals, we classified them all into this other group for the purpose of this graphic. So we can now talk about search rates. Overall, individuals were searched 9.9% of individuals in the data set for 2018 were subjected to a search. You all will recall that in the data collection form, you can officers can select that they performed a search of an individual's property or a search of the person themselves. And so we find that in 2018 that 9.2% of individuals had a search of their person conducted on them, whereas 4% of individuals had their property searched. Those two percentages don't add up to the 9.9 overall, but that's because there's some overlap in some individuals having a search of both type conducted on them. So we see here that the highest search rate across the race and ethnicity groups was for Black individuals who had of the Black individuals that were stopped during this data collection period, 18.7% of them were subjected to a search. And then on the other side of the distribution, we have that Middle Eastern or South Asian individuals had the lowest search rate, with 2.8% of their stopped individuals being searched during the data collection period. White individuals fell third from the right on this bar graph, with 6.5% of their stopped individuals being subjected to a search. I'm going to skip this one and come back to it. So the previous slide that we talked about search rates overall, and that's just how often individuals were searched by group. What we also wanted to explore was the efficacy of these searches, or how often individuals who were searched were found to be in possession of contraband or evidence, which is the reason for conducting a search. And so to do this, we looked at hit rates. And what hit rates are the proportion of individuals who are searched that were found to be in possession of contraband or evidence. And there's like a little formula down there, but that's basically what that communicates right there. And so in order to do this, we performed some overall hit rates that examined all individuals who were searched during the data collection period. And then we also spliced the data in a few ways that would address some of the board members' requests at the Stop Data Subcommittee meeting that we last held. So we also looked at this based on calls for service, and then we also tried to take a look at the amount of discretion that we can assume was available to officers when making the decision to search individuals. So we'll first go over the overall search hit rates. And so this slide goes over the overall search hit rates. And so what we have here is every single individual during the data collection period who was searched. And we compare that then to a reference group of white individuals. So search hit rates ranged from 18.8% of stopped individuals from a specific group being found to be in possession of contraband or evidence when they're searched, to 24.3% of stopped individuals from a group. And so the group with the highest search hit rate was whites, and the group with the lowest was Middle Eastern, South Asian. And they had 18.8%. And so this graphic here, figure 6, which again isn't numbered in the order of this presentation, but is taken directly from the report that everyone should have at this point. What this displays is that this black line here that goes to the middle is the white search hit rate. And what we know from seeing that all the bars fall below that is that officers tended to find contraband or evidence less frequently when they searched individuals who are members of racial groups of color in comparison to white individuals. The percentage point difference between white individuals' search rates and search rates of racial groups of color ranged from 1.8% lower for black individuals up to 5.6 percentage points lower than whites for Middle Eastern, South Asian individuals. Okay, this is where I need to go back. So we also, previous research has also examined search hit rates by the amount of discretion available to officers at the time when they initiate the search. And so we've adopted some of the practices that previous researchers have used when analyzing these types of data. And we basically took the information that officers provide as the basis for the search. For every search that they conduct, board members will remember that that's a whole section of the stop data collection forms that they're required to fill out. If an officer indicates that they searched an individual, they're then prompted to provide a basis or bases for why they performed that search. And so what we've done here is basically classified the search, the bases for search into two groups. a higher discretion group and what we call a lower discretion group. And so the higher discretion group of search bases is our searches where the only search basis provided by officers was that the person consented to the search, and there were no other search bases provided other than the person said that they consented to be searched. And the lower discretion search group is our searches that were conducted incident to arrest, vehicle inventory searches, and search warrants. And the reason why these are classified as lower discretion searches is that these searches occur after law enforcement officers have already made a decision to take some type of enforcement action. In the case of searches made incident to arrest, they've already got a basis to place a person under arrest, or a vehicle inventory search is an administrative search that they conduct after they've decided to impound a vehicle. And in the case of search warrants, they already have a legal order to perform the search. And so previous research has treated these types of searches as lower discretion, meaning that officers don't have as much discretion under these circumstances because they've already made a decision to take enforcement action. And what we see here in the figure on the right is just a breakdown of the race and ethnicity groups by the discretion type. And so the bar on the left are the higher discretion searches, and the bar on the right are the lower discretion searches. And what we see here overall is just that, well, overall, Black, white, and Hispanic individuals make up close to 90% of the data during this data collection period, and so it's harder to see some of the bars at the top. But for higher discretion searches, we see that Hispanic and Black individuals are represented at a higher percentage there than they are in the lower discretion searches. And in the lower discretion searches, white individuals represent a larger proportion of that group. And so we also break down search hit rates by search discretion level. And so what we have here is similar to on the slide prior to this. So just to refresh everyone, this is what the overall hit rates looked like. And then here we break it down. So there's a graphic there that displays the higher discretion searches on the left and then the lower discretion searches on the right. And overall what we find is that officers were less likely to get hits on racial groups of color compared to white individuals for higher discretion searches. And that trend is consistent across all racial groups of color. And if we flip back to the overall rates, you can see here that the overall rates range between 1.8% percentage points below to 5.6. And when we look at just the higher discretion searches, they actually range all the way up to 6%. And a lot of the groups actually have a larger difference between their search hit rates and white individual search hit rates. And then for the lower discretion searches, what we observe is that many racial groups of color still have lower search hit rates than white individuals, but the magnitude and the difference between whites and racial groups of color is less for many of these groups. And there are actually two racial groups that had slightly higher search hit rates than whites, those being Black individuals and Native American individuals. What we'll also notice here is that higher discretion searches, you can see that the base search hit rate is 16.2% for higher discretion hit rates and 25.5% for lower discretion hit rates, indicating that officers find contraband more often when they conduct lower discretion searches. So those conducted incident to arrest, vehicle inventory searches, or pursuant to a search warrant. We also received requests to break the data down by whether or not officers were responding to a call for service. And so we also performed analyses that take that into account. So here we display some information on calls for service. Just as a reminder to everyone, calls for officers can indicate whether each person was stopped in response to a call for service, and this is not a reason for stop. It's collected independently to the reason for stop that they provide. So we defined calls for service is just when officers indicate that a person was stopped in response to calls for service, and then we called times when they did not indicate that a person was stopped in response to call for service as officer-initiated stops. So that's just kind of the terminology we use throughout here. We're not married to calling them officer-initiated stops, so if anyone has some different terminology that they'd like to use there, let us know, and we can change it in your report. But overall, we find that 95.3% of the individuals that were stopped during the data collection period were stopped on officer-initiated stops, and 4.7% of individuals who were stopped during the data collection period were stopped in response to a call for service. So the racial breakdown of individuals who were stopped in response to calls for service and officer-initiated stops varied slightly, and you can kind of see that there. Again, this figure is similar to a figure we saw on a previous slide where the bar on the left represents individuals who were stopped in response to a call for service, and the bar on the right represents individuals who were stopped on officer-initiated stops. And there we can see that officer-initiated stops have a little bit higher of a percentage of the individuals that were stopped for that reason being perceived to be Hispanic and white, and calls for service had a little bit higher percentage of the stopped individuals that were stopped for that reason perceived to be black than black people's representation in officer-initiated stops. Now, that's not to say that more black individuals were stopped for calls for service than officer-initiated stops, because only about 5% of all stopped individuals were stopped in response to a call for service. Yes, so we also broke down search hit rates by calls for service, and isolated only individuals who were stopped in response to a call for service. And I apologize for this slide. We took the graphics out of the report, and in the report, in a previous draft, we had removed this graphic to, I think, make something fit on a page, and then now when we took the graphics off of the pages to put them in the PowerPoint presentation here, we didn't have one yesterday to do, so I apologize for that. We'll definitely include one in the draft moving forward. But just to recap, overall, we see that all racial groups of color had lower search hit rates than white individuals. And when we examine the data for just that 5% of individuals who were stopped in response to a call for service, we see that that the differences between whites and racial groups of color were generally, between a few specific racial groups of color, multiracial, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and black individuals was less pronounced, meaning that the percentage difference between the search rate of white individuals and those four groups was less for stopped persons who were stopped in response to a call for service. We also looked at officer-initiated stops, which tended to look similar to the trend for when we considered all individuals. That's likely because those individuals represent 95% of the data set, and so therefore we would expect their trends to look very similar to the overall trends. So kind of a summary of some of the findings that we've had so far with our data analyses, and again, we're still continuing to perform more data analyses moving forward, is that we saw that some racial groups had higher search rates than white individuals. When examining all searches, we see the trend that all racial groups of color had lower search hit rates than white individuals. We also observed that the difference between search hit rates for racial groups of color and whites were generally greater for searches where the officers had more discretion, and lower for searches where officers had less discretion. And then finally, when examining calls for service and the search hit rates, we saw that the differences between racial groups of colors and white individuals was generally less pronounced. And so those are the analyses that we've been able to put in your report to date. Again, these are all from looking at the data from all agencies that are reporting for 2018. We do plan to break these analyses out by agency in the technical appendix that we'll be drafting, but that basically requires us to do what we've done here 8 times over, and so it's gonna take a while, and we'll have to decide in future years if that's a sustainable model for including in the report with the amount of discussion that we'll have of these analyses overall when we start having 15, 20-something, and then eventually 400-something agencies collecting by the time that all agencies get on board. But this is what we've provided for you thus far. We plan to have more in November, and we appreciate feedback that the board can provide.
Very good. Thank you, Kevin. Would members like to provide some comment or questions? Go ahead.
One thing I was wondering is, for example, on page 13, we have the stop demographics of stopped individuals by race. But what that's missing, and I think it's hard because we have geographically dispersed agencies, is what percentage of the population each group is composed of. So like, it says 15% of stops are black, but what's the percentage of black people in the population, and maybe we can do that at agency level so we can understand the data better. I know that would be hard because everybody's all around the state in this initial, but I would really love to see that maybe demographic data when you do the agency snapshots.
The board, okay, yeah, great. The board's reports in previous years have kind of discussed some of the limitations in comparing stop data to population, whether it be residential population data or traffic or driver data, right? So I know that the board's recommendations last year for the types of analyses that it would produce this year relied heavily on the outcome analyses that we're presenting here, as well as some of the veil of darkness technique, which kind of aims to do something similar to what you're talking about, and looking at individuals who are stopped and whether or not the proportion of individuals that are stopped and and where they fall along the racial and ethnic groups is what we would anticipate seeing if all groups were being treated equal. And so we definitely, one of the analyses that we're going to be producing here and starting on next week, the veil of darkness techniques gets at that question. You are correct that it's a little bit complicated with only having data from 8 agencies. We'd like to find a way to get some data that would allow for us to kind of compare a little bit to population, but it's complicated for some agencies because, say, for instance, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department does not only serve residents of unincorporated Los Angeles because they have contracts with incorporated cities that fall within the county of Los Angeles, and so then comparing their stop data to population data that just takes into account the unincorporated areas of Los Angeles County, leaves out those sections of the population in those incorporated areas that they serve. And so it's not a one-to-one comparison of who they're providing services to and who they're stopping, in addition to some other issues surrounding there just being different populations in areas that do not reside there, and most of our population data that we have access to, unfortunately, is based on residents of areas, like census data, but we know that there are certain areas of the state that are more sensitive to just having influxes of populations that aren't captured in census data, like areas with large colleges. They have their populations can change drastically between seasons, and so those types of comparisons are oftentimes tricky to make. But we definitely we would like to find a way to do it in a way that's fair and provides people good information rather than just using the easiest data source for us to then quickly do it. And so that's why we haven't done any of those types of comparisons yet, because we're looking for a way to do it in a way that's going to be communicating real information to people rather than just looking at population versus the amount of individuals that were stopped. So we're interested in looking into it, but it's pretty complicated, which is why for the first year we've decided to go with the veil of darkness technique, which does not rely on population data, but rather uses an internal benchmark in daylight savings time and assumed visibility conditions to look at whether or not officers tend to stop certain race ethnicity groups during hours of the day when they can't as easily perceive their race due to it being dark out in comparison to when it's daylight out. So that's kind of the approach that we've planned on, but we are constantly looking for ways to improve upon what we're able to provide.
Thank you.
Just piggybacking on that, I mean, and that's why I asked about the CHP stuff earlier, because it is a statewide agency that's stopping people up from border to border. But I think it's critical to have those kinds of comparisons to give a sense to the public of what we're doing. I mean, to say that 15% of the stops were made of African Americans, well, African Americans make up 6.5% of California's population. So twice the number of their population, according to the stop data we have, are being stopped. But if you don't have any kind of demographic data, and again, that's a statewide population, but if you don't have any demographic data to compare it to, these numbers kind of don't mean much. And we really need to tell the public what is happening. That's the whole purpose of the mission of the RIPA board, is to weed out discrimination in stops by the police. And so we have to come up with some kind of demographic data, either by jurisdiction or statewide, in order to make those comparisons to what we have here, be my opinion.
Yeah, if I could add to that, and we had a full conversation about this in the first quarter of the year, right? We pulled together the Stop Data Committee and the Policy Committee. I can't remember. We pulled a few committees together with law enforcement leaders and with academics, and we looked at this question, right? What was the appropriate contextual data? And then following that, the board had a conversation about the importance of working with academics and researchers, external researchers. And I thought we had directed DOJ to engage with them contractually, recognizing that your research shop is new and this is hard stuff, as you point out. So where are we with that? So a few questions. One, are we working with outside experts? Two, are we going to be making this data, the raw data, available to researchers who could help us digest it in general? Not necessarily ones we contract with. And three, at this juncture, what are the contextual data points or data sets that we do think that we can incorporate into this first report?
So I think the first question there was the external research body that the board wanted us to get a contract with. So we did take the board up on that recommendation, and we've since contracted with the Public Policy Institute of California, and so they've lended us some researchers to assist with the work that we're doing. Dr. Magnus Lofstrom is helping us, along with Brandon Martin. We also had another researcher there, Justin Goss, assisting with some of the work earlier on. He's since moved on from PPIC, and so we just have the two contractors currently assisting us with the work. And so they've assisted us in developing some of these methods and kind of tailoring our approach thus far. We are going to be meeting with them. We've brought up the issue that was brought up at the last subcommittee meeting on population-based data. And so we have to meet with them here shortly. We've been trying to ramp up the analyses that we could provide to you at this point in time, but they are working to kind of structure data that we could potentially use to provide some context around or using population data to provide context, but in a way where it accounts for those jurisdictions that agencies serve that is outside of what we would normally believe to be their jurisdiction. So they are assisting with that. We haven't nailed anything down as far as something that we can produce, at least before this board meeting, but we're still going to be meeting with them about getting that information, maybe before the next one, board meeting. What was the second question? I'm sorry.
Is the raw data going to be available for researchers?
Yes, so the idea is that we would make raw data available, raw data available and publish it to the AG's Open Justice data portal. that's where it's going? Cress, is that the idea?
That's the idea, yes.
Okay, the idea is
Would
that.
you want me to answer that question then?
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Happy. So we are also producing and have already produced some of the data, not the full set, under the Public Records Act. We have requests out. I don't know if we mentioned, I don't think this was mentioned in the last meeting, but we did find some personally identifying information in some of the narrative fields. So our Public Records Act requests are, have been delayed in terms of getting narrative field data to individuals. All of the other non-narrative fields have been produced to several agencies, and so we are working. We've had requests from individual citizens as well as the press, and so they have the data sets, but not the open narrative fields. And by the open narrative fields, I mean the basis for the search, the reason for the stop, as well as the address in terms of the location, because we found that some agencies were including like apartment numbers and residences are not to be provided. So the reason we are not producing that information right now are based solely on privacy reasons for the individuals who are stopped and for the officers as well, because there was some officer information that was included in some of the narrative fields. So that will eventually get put on Open Justice. I'm not sure about the format, but the information will be publicly available. I don't know what exactly is going to be put on Open Justice per se. And just to also piggyback on what Kevin said, the Civil Rights Enforcement Section has retained 2 experts, Jack Glazer and Emily Owens. Jack comes from UC Berkeley, and Emily Owens is from UC Irvine. These are academics that were at our meeting in February, and so we are working with them along with CGIS and the Research Center as well to help with the interpretation and analysis of the data, and to provide it in a way that is easily accessible not only to the board but to the public in general, because this is fairly complex work. The Research Center has been working really hard on this. It took them a while to get the data into a good shape where they could actually analyze it. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're really ahead of the curve, and we're really much farther along than we had hoped to be at this point. So I'm really pleased, and I want to thank the Research Center for really expediting their work on this as well. And I can't remember, Andrea, your third question, but I think that addresses the first 2.
Yeah. My third question was, what are the data points, the contextual data points that we're going to use? But it sounds like you're looking to Jack Glazer and Emily Owens to help you identify what those are.
And the subcommittee as well.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so
Which
it's going to be really...
Which Professor Steve Raphael is now a member of.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that's going to be very, very important for our next meeting.
Yes.
Can I offer just a few comments? So I like the draft. It looks very clear. It looks great. You guys did a good job. I just had a couple of suggestions that maybe for a little bit of additional work, but not too much, and then maybe to address some of the issue about the many different agencies and what might be one cut that might be worth doing. In terms of the resident population comparison, there is this kind of fundamental issue that we have officers' perception, and then the resident population is self-described in the census. And, in the census codes, Hispanic as ethnicity and race is something else in the cross. And so it might be worthwhile just to think about how you might, what are the rules you're going to impose on the data to decide, who's Hispanic and whether you want to make them mutually exclusive, and how you define someone who's African American, given that there are multiple racial categories. And there are lots of different ways to do it, but researchers basically all do it the same way. And so I think it would be easy to generate statewide estimates of, you know, the race ethnicity distribution for California, that wouldn't be too hard. And then also for the PDs, for the law enforcement agencies that are municipally based, the ACS, actually, the American Community Survey, does identify, you know, separate data for each one of those cities, at least for the phase one. So we could estimate, you know, the racial composition of those cities once you have that rule in place. It should be doable. I think the harder part is where you have the sheriff departments that are, you know, covering the whole county, and then you have big patches that are not in their jurisdiction. And so, you know, you might just go with the county in that sense, but, you know, propose something and then see what happens. Then two other questions. My guess would be that if you took CHP out, the proportion that are call for service is probably a lot higher, right?
Yes, so CHP had the lowest proportion of their stops that were initiated in response to a call for service, and agencies tended to be. So the percentage of stops that are made in response to a call for service was 4.7% in the data overall. If you remove CHP and just look at the rest of the data, it's around 10.
Mm-hmm. No, so it's not that different. Yeah.
It's double, but yeah, it's not like anything extremely high.
It might be worthwhile just running, you know, the programs, keeping CHP out, see if anything looks different, and writing it up in a footnote or something because CHP is going to receive a lot of weight, because I imagine it's the overwhelming majority of stops. And then the only other thing, that I would ask, and this is a little bit complex, but not too bad, that I wonder if you have some sense of whether or not the differences you see in the hit rates can be explained by other aspects of the data. So for example, is it that African American searches are one particular type of search where the hit rate is low for everybody, and they're concentrated in those searches, and so if you control for that in kind of a multivariate analysis, does it explain the difference? Or is it across all categories of searches that you just see lower hit rates for certain groups relative to others? And you've kind of already started to do that when you split the data into discretionary and non-discretionary, right? So we see in you know, right there that you have one group where it's bigger, one group where it's smaller, and it might be interesting to pair that figure with a figure that shows, okay, what proportion of searches of people of different race and ethnicity are discretion, you know, high discretion versus low discretion, and then maybe doing that in, you know, for a couple of different cuts, you know, in terms of whether it was you know, a stop that was a call for service, or whether it was even though it's a small group, call for service, not for call for service, or whether it was a probable cause stop versus a traffic stop, and so on and so forth, and maybe picking a few key dimensions where you think it might matter, and just exploring how much of what you're seeing is differences that persist within groups, and how much is it just that, you know, there's differences in the distribution across groups.
Right, and so that's kind of the idea behind some of the stuff that we've already done. We're looking at discretion level and calls for service as has been requested. But if you have specific ideas about other ways that you think would be interesting for us to kind of splice the data to rerun some of these analyses, to explore whether or not there are other factors that are kind of mediating some of these relationships that we're seeing, we definitely appreciate your input. I know that you gave us input after the last version or the subcommittee meeting that changed how we were performing the hit rates kind of drastically, because before we were including all of the identity groups in there, and the model was much bigger. So if you have specific ideas, feel free to shoot us an email. If not, then we can talk again on the 10th about some of those ways that you might think that it would be helpful for us to examine the search hit rates some more.
Great. Any additional comments?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I think the data was awesome. I'm glad you broke it down like this, but I just have one question. When it comes to the age, if we could look at that, in certain areas, people seem to think that teenagers are being targeted like between 19 to 24, but if you can really clarify that, if you could just give us some data on that, if that has something to do with this. Because of your age, you could be, that could be a problem.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we're also working on like a technical appendix to go at the back of the board's report that kind of is a little bit in depth in some ways that we're not able to provide a report body for, and age is one of the identity group variables that we're also examining there. So there will be some information on age that makes it into a future version of the report. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
On this.
Pastor Boyd?
Yeah, thank you. The census is taken once every 10 years, so it gives us a pretty good indication of where migratory and gentrification rates and movements actually occur. And in the sense that we're getting information from the 8 largest law enforcement agencies across the state, probably contains pretty accurate information on the larger and most densely populated areas across the state, which is good. But then again, understanding the wisdom of our directing this whole process indicate that an officer would make that perception of race from their own visuals, and not by asking questions and not by looking at documented identification they may have. That's great. But how can we be assured, based upon the collection of data, and I know the analytical process from the institution just goes based upon what's given to them. But back to DOJ, how we actually engage them and what data we requested and required of law enforcement officers would be tremendously important. So if they can collect wide enough fields for you to make a good analysis, and if we can overlay that against trends that may be shown in the census, we get a better indication. So I just want to know, how comfortable are you in your analysis that these pretty much reflect racial identities as they are? Because as I understand it, once every decade or 2 decades, it becomes more and more difficult to identify who an African American or who a Latino or an Asian American may or may not be, just from a visual.
Right. So the data that are collected, I mean, you mentioned that census data, I believe Dr. Raphael also mentioned this earlier, but that census data is collected and it's self-identified data versus these data that we're collecting for the purpose of RIPA being based on officer perception. I'm actually not familiar with the last part of the statement that you made there about
what I was
different
indicating
generations.
is the census would tell us where people are and pretty much tell where racial makeups actually exist and where populations of particular ethnicities are. We can get that trend. So if we got the data from you and from what DOJ is requesting, that can be easily be overlaid against. So when you look at 15% of African Americans in a population, if that actually looks at a particular population where the census data say there's a larger connection and propensity in residency of African Americans, that can help us pretty much do that. But without that, it's kind of hard to make that call.
Right, I see what you're saying now, yeah. Well, speaking back to my point from earlier, there's also a method that we're going to be producing this year that aims to look at whether or not who we observe in the data being stopped is different than what we would expect if racial groups were treated equally through use of the veil of darkness method, which again doesn't rely on residential population information, but is a method that was developed by Groger and Ridgway in the early 2002 RAND researchers that were doing information for RAND analysis for RAND Corporation of, I believe they used Oakland PD data in their initial study. And so it was developed to address the kind of the shortcomings of comparing stop data to population-based data. And we're going to be producing that sort of analysis beginning here shortly, because we now, up until this point in the year, we didn't have the third-party information that we needed to complete that analysis, but we do. It finished running over last weekend, so we have it now. When we're done with this meeting, we go back next week, we're going to begin on it. So we are going to be producing analyses that get at some of that issue, but also to your issue that the census is only taken every 10 years and the populations change. There are also, in the years in between when the actual census survey is sent out, they do estimates of population changes every year, and so we wouldn't be necessarily comparing to, if we did some form of comparison like this year, just for example, in 2019, it's been 9 years since the last full census was conducted. There have been updates to that with census information and estimates every year since then. So we could compare to estimates based on this year, or technically, I guess, 2018, right? Since that's the data that we have. But 2018 data, that we wouldn't then be comparing data that's 8 years apart, so using that. So the census does have a way of accounting for shifts in population.
Yeah, and just really wanted to underscore Ms. Bembo's comments and notions earlier of the importance of understanding the population that the analysis is being made in, so we get real clear indications of the accuracy of population and ethnicity within those populations. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional comment? Did you have a comment?
Yeah, one more comment. So thank you for this data. It's, I'm sure, no small task to crunch the numbers for 1.7 million stops. And I appreciate that we have this information early in the year with a full quarter to go and another board meeting to look at the data, to put together a high-quality report. And I just want to make sure that we are keeping an eye on the other identity characteristics that were outlined in our mandate, including age, which Lawanda are already highlighted, but also gender, LGBT identity, English fluency, and disability.
Right, yeah. We have tables in the appendix sections that we've been working on thus far that cover a lot of those groups. Although we do, as you've seen today, we've done some more in-depth analysis that surrounds race and ethnicity. If there are other specific, because our reasoning behind that is what's kind of dominated a lot of the discussions here at previous board meetings, or issues that are specific to law enforcement interactions with communities of color. However, if we have other specific research questions that surround the other identity groups that RIPA requires data collection on, we'd love to hear those. We're here to attempt to find empirical ways to address the questions that the board has, and until we have those questions, it's hard for us to anticipate what you'd all like to see. So yes, absolutely, we're going to be including tables and some analyses in the appendix sections that look at those other identity groups. But specific research questions that you may have are always appreciated, because it helps us narrow our approach and focus what we do.
Zahar?
One last thing is, again, this was a huge undertaking, and really appreciate all the work that you guys have done. One suggestion is, it is, you know, a very complex document. It's hard to digest, and a lot of the point of this legislation was transparency to the community. And so if we could maybe create a fact sheet where, with like at a reading level that's accessible to the community, where a lot of these data sets are encapsulated in an appendix or what have you, I think that would be very beneficial.
And I would just like to add that if we have, any of the board members have additional questions or data sets that they'd like to see, we can always email the Department of Justice after the meeting and let them know additional inquiries that we might like to see and discuss those at the next board meeting. And just to clarify, being a sheriff's office is, we have jurisdiction in the entire county, including the cities. We just don't handle their calls for service, but we do enforcement in those areas. And so you can't necessarily go, okay, well, we're going to pull out that city and say that that sheriff's office doesn't do service there. We do additional services as well, coroner services, civil services, et cetera. And so each agency has their own bread and butter per se. But many of us overlap in jurisdictions.
That's very true, actually. I guess, yeah, I didn't speak to that earlier, but it is true that your jurisdiction encompasses cities, incorporated areas throughout the county as well.
So it adds an additional challenge to try to draw in.
It does add an additional challenge, because the amount of responsibility or services that you provide is different in separate areas of the community when we talk about the community as a county as a whole, right? So many of your services are concentrated in unincorporated areas, but you still do provide some services to areas that are in incorporated areas within your county. And so we may not anticipate seeing contacts with individuals in the incorporated areas quite as often to compare against. So that is a fair point, that it does kind of make comparisons a little bit more difficult sometimes for sheriff's departments.
Absolutely. Any additional questions or comments by board members before we open it to the public comment?
Sheriff Robinson, before you do, just a point of order, that subcommittee, the Stop Data Subcommittee needs to approve the minutes from November 2018 so they can go on the website.
For the Stop Data Committee?
Yes.
Okay.
Because before the committees merged, those minutes were not approved. And so now that the committees are merged, we have to approve those minutes so that we can publish those.
And it would just be that committee voting on that?
Yes.
Okay. So hopefully everybody knows who's on that committee. I have no idea. I'm on like 5.
We do.
I'm on that committee. I'll move to approve those.
Very good.
minutes.
We have a motion by Oscar. Do we have a second?
And I'll second that.
I think technically you're not on that
Okay,
subcommittee.
perfect. I won't vote then.
No, you're not on that subcommittee.
Okay.
So
Oscar made the motion.
So those of you that are on that Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee, we have a motion and a second. If those of you could speak up for your vote, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Abstention on that one, okay. Chief? Aye. Anybody that we missed on that?
Aye.
Okay, thank you, Luana.
Aye.
Thank you. Did we cover everybody?
Yeah, that, it carries.
Okay, very good. The motion carries. Thank you very much. We'll make sure we get those technicalities in. At this time, just for the public's information, on the agenda later is also the overall board discussion of the 2020 draft RIPA report. So the data is also included in that. So we'll have an additional discussion on the overall RIPA report. So for the public comments, anything that we've talked about so far this morning, now would be your opportunity to come forward. Oh, there we go. Come forward to the microphone, and if you're so inclined, state your name and city of residence, and just let us know what your comment is this morning. So we'll open it up for public comment at this point for anybody that would like to come forward.
Sheriff, how long will you be entertaining public comment? How many minutes?
You know, historically, I think we've gone with 3 minutes, but, you know, we're pretty flexible on this board, so we wouldn't necessarily want to limit somebody to exactly 3 minutes, but we would just ask to be respectful of everyone's time today and keep your comments concise to your point. Thank you. Go ahead, come forward.
Good morning, Board. My name is Jeff Jordan. I'm a captain with the San Diego Police Department. My official job duties entail legislative affairs, special projects. RIPA pretty much incorporates both of those. So a couple quick questions, and I think they're more directed towards Kevin. In regards to discretionary stops, and at least from the presentation, RIPA requires officers to document any one of 12 different categories in a search. I was wondering how many of those categories were incorporated into the high discretionary, low discretionary. At least it looks like from the presentation there was about 4. I was wondering if it is 4, why the other 8 were excluded, in particular regards to persons on probation, parole that may have mandatory supervision. You know, many officers would look at that as basically a mandatory reason to search, since it's a mandatory supervisor of release. So to explain the ones that were included, not included, and then potentially even talk about what percentage of the search data was incorporated into the high discretionary, low discretionary, i.e. if it was 4 areas, what components of those 4 areas, how many percentages that make up? Is it 80, 90%? Maybe a little description on that I'd like to know. In addition to that, just some of the other categories that may have been excluded. For example, you know, if it's exigent circumstances, most people may consider that an element of the search that they would record. Exigent circumstances could be an officer walking up, seeing a firearm in the car or something along those lines, or even spilled alcohol in regards to, or narcotics in regards to a stop, plain view. Just a little bit more information would, I think, be helpful to law enforcement, and then an explanation to the board as to what was included, not included in high discretionary, low discretionary. And I think even a comparison as to how other researchers do that, whether Dr. Eberhard or Dr. Glazer, Dr. Goff, CPE, how they break high discretionary, low discretionary out. So one question in 30 parts. Go ahead, sir.
I will try to respond to as many elements of that question as I can.
You don't need to respond to public comment.
Yeah, it's just a public comment at this point. So
Gotcha.
and anyone who has a public comment, we're going to take that into consideration, obviously, and that will be open for the board to either ask clarifying at this point or ask clarifying later on through an email or a direct question to the Department of Justice. Ma'am, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jamie, and I live here. So I'm trying to keep up with everything you guys are talking about, so forgive me if I'm asking a question that you possibly already touched on. But I'm looking at the template that's going to be for grades K through 12, and I'm wondering why we're not doing, on there, there's the option to mark all areas of perceived ethnicity, because I'm worried that when we're talking about mixed or multiracial, that's also Black, that we're missing, that's a whole percentage that needs to be added into Black, just because in my experience, that's generally when we refer to someone as multiracial or mixed, we're talking about Black. Most people are talking about Black. So if possibly in the future, the way the template is for multiple races or ethnicities to be marked off in not just the K through 12 data card, but the other ones too. And then I know you talked about it a little bit about the STOP data cards being split up eventually into units, divisions, special teams, stuff like that. And I think that's super important. We are kind of seeing throughout California, and I want to hear for sure in San Diego, that we're seeing a lot of what we feel is an abuse of gang enhancements and gang allegations, and specifically done by what, it keeps changing the name, but it was gang unit, then it was special operations team, and I don't know what it's called anymore. But we would like to see that information, how the stops are being split up by units within the departments also. We have a lot of young people who are facing 10 years of a gang allegation enhancement, and we need the information in these stop cards to include these gang units as well. Thank you.
Just to clarify, kind
Sure.
of task force specific?
Yes.
To those
Yes,
things?
please.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Appreciate that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Glover. I live in Oceanside. I'm a professor at Cal State San Marcos. Thank you for everything you're doing. This is very powerful work that you're doing. But with all due respect, I have about 8 points for you. So my first point is looking over the draft, the 2020 draft, and I study the police. I forgot to say that. That's my area of study. Your 2020 draft, the policy and accountability section of that really is very light on accountability. Your 2 descriptive paragraphs don't even mention the word accountability. It's a focus on policy. Accountability issues, which from my sense is the issue of sanction, the action that happens once you have some determination that discrimination is going on. What do you do about it? So accountability issues should be driving, I think, this part of your discussion. And what you're doing, with all due respect, is making sure that there's policy in place, and on some level that has the effect of legitimizing some of your work. When it has less of effect, it could be argued, on the actual practice of stopping law enforcement practices that are discriminatory. There's some work by a scholar called Kirk Miller, that goes to this idea. He actually studies police departments, looks to see whether they have a racial profiling policy, and then kind of sees how it actually operates in practice. And he argues it's operating really as a legitimizing kind of context for the law enforcement agency, and not so much for the actual practices of the law enforcement officers themselves. So that's point 1. Related, what we're really wanting is accountability that has to do with real sanction, mapped out, real action, and meaningful steps taken. Point 2 is, I think I just did point 2 as well. Lexipol, I would caution you to be engaging Lexipol. Lexipol on some level is the antithesis of what this board was created to do. Lexipol is, a lot of people who study the police forever don't even know about Lexipol. And it is on some level law enforcement driven, not community driven, which is what your board is supposed to be on some level reflecting. And it produces kind of template policies for law enforcement agents. And I would caution you in part because it's really a law enforcement driven as opposed to a community driven organization. Your stop data, a couple points there. And some of this is philosophical, and please stop me if I'm taking up too much time. Racial profiling and other types of identity profiling, what on some level y'all are focusing on, just because of what you kind of have to do, is what happens after the stop. What happens before the stop, the determination before the stop is also important. For instance, if a lot of your information is talking about the reason the police officer gives for the stop, the officer is generally saying a traffic violation occurred. What you're not capturing, and y'all may have already had this discussion, but what you're not capturing, time's up? Okay.
Cutting it close. If you could wrap up, or on the side when we take a break, if you want to give me your list, I'd be happy to
Okay,
take
what
all
you're
that
not
as well.
capturing is the white folks who make traffic violations and don't get stopped, right? Another point with the baseline issue, which we've been studying racial profiling, as a thing for 2 or 3 decades now, and the baseline issue has been a concern since day one. But you actually have data. You have data from the community. You have narratives from the community that are backing up these demonstrations that there is racially discriminatory practices going on. You have an additional set of data, and it's narrative data from the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ava Bitran. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California. Thank you all so much for this presentation, for your time, and for the ability to provide comment. 3 quick points. The first is that we would really urge the Department of Justice and the board to provide analysis, or at the very least release data in a way that allows some kind of cross-comparison within these groups. So for example, Black women, Hispanic men of a particular age range. So if the data set could be at least released in a way that might allow this kind of comparison, I think that would be really fruitful. The second point is that, we certainly understand the really tough place and the concerns that the department might have between being privacy protective and releasing narrative fields in data, and we appreciate all the work that the department is doing to kind of solve that problem, and just want to reiterate the importance that we see in releasing those narrative fields and all the rich content that they contain. And then the final point is half of a question, but in partly a comment. I understood in the communication between Member Durali and Mr. Walker that the methods that will be used to analyze the data may be subject to review in following years. I just wanted to confirm if that's my understanding, if my understanding is correct, and I'm curious to see, in general, what the process might be for suggesting what other methodologies may be appropriate in future years for future reports. Thank you again for your time and this opportunity.
Thank you.
And you may recognize Ava from our RIPA board video. We have 2 of our stars here today, and here comes our next one to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Katie Matthews. I'm with Disability Rights California. I'm a staff attorney there in the investigations unit. I want to echo a few things that Ava said and kind of expand on that. One is, I think Mr. Walker asked about research questions and other things that I think that this, specifically the stop data portion, could address. I think it's amazing how much work you guys have done at this point, but I think it would be really helpful to have the same analysis done for all the other identities, for age, for gender, for disability, obviously, English fluency, and LGBT identity. I think that would be really helpful, at least in Appendix 10, but even to be able to talk about any interesting things that were brought up by doing that analysis would be really helpful, I think, to anyone who's reading this report. Intersectionality is really important. I wonder if there's a way to look at the individuals who are Black with a disability, or who the officer perceives as LGBTQ with a disability. I think those, in practice and in what the work I do, I've seen overwhelmingly that individuals who are stopped or who have issues with local law enforcement agencies tend to have multiple identities that may make them a target for harassment and other issues. I would also say that it's important to, I think this idea that perfect is the enemy of good, is I think it's really important to be able to discuss on a broader point, whether it's race, whether it's disability, whether it's gender or age, the percentage of people who are stopped versus the greater population, whether that's the ACS data, whether that's general census data. I think that's very important to compare so that there's some baseline that the reader can compare it to. And then again, I would just emphasize that I know there's been discussions of when this is going to be released on Open Justice. I would really urge, if possible, to do it as soon as possible. I think that when it comes to legitimacy and getting this information out to the greater public, it's important to do so as soon as possible. So that would be my last comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
James Halliday, San Diego resident, representing the Citizens Advisory Board, Police Community Relations here in San Diego. I want to reiterate vicariously a question posed to SDPD in a recent meeting that we had as a board, which is, I'm looking here at the reporting requirements, page 9 in the report. And the question was why race and other identity features of the officer making the stop aren't included in the data. And then the second point is for all members here, an invitation and encouragement to seek out if there's a border commission doing work at local levels, and an invitation to Member Guerrero and any others from San Diego on the panel to engage with our board. I chair the coordination committee, so that's just want to extend that invitation. Thank you very much for your work.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. I believe our next agenda item is take a break. We're almost actually right close to schedule. So the next item is item number 7, calls for a break at 12:15 to re-adjourn at 12:45. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, so we're going to take a break and adjourn now and reconvene at 12:45.